Sophie Hardy and the Internet Implant by M.R. Dale, narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 20, The Debrief. After the girls had just sat in silence for about half an hour in Clara's room, the trio got comfortable and logged into their implants. They were under instruction from Miss Sissons to return to Shadow HQ for a debrief as soon as they had Clara, but they took the opportunity to catch up first. After a quick flash of lights, all three were stood in the main reception area of the building that the world was finding so reclusive. To Clara, this place was nothing new, but for Sophie and Yasmin, there was a lot to take in. The floor was gleaming, shining white, and around the edge of the room behind them stretched a huge grey U-shaped sofa with blue cushions. Behind that hung a piece of art that looked most unusual. It had a painting of a huge gleaming white tower block that tickled the clouds and was surrounded by snow, which looked to be actually moving in the painting. All around the skyscraper, which reminded Sophie somewhat of somewhere but she couldn't pinpoint what, spacecrafts hovered as if delivering or taking away things like lorries at a depot. Sophie studied it more carefully and could see tiny people drawn into the painting. She could have sworn she saw them move as if they were almost waving at her. Her gaze didn't linger on too long, though, as above them was a huge circular light. It dominated the ceiling and lit up the room like the sun itself. In front of the girls stood a long white reception desk. There was nothing on top of it, and it gleamed like the floor. Behind the desk, on the wall, was written Shadow in amazing grey letters that curled round each other, and to its right was a corridor that stretched for what looked like miles. This place was so clean and spotless that it had clearly remained untouched for a long time. Knowing her way around already, Clara simply walked up to the desk and put her hand on top of it. A light under her hand flashed red twice, then green. A few seconds later, footsteps could be heard coming, albeit slowly, down the corridor to the side of reception. Alton King appeared at the side of the desk. Clara Betts, welcome back. King was still drained of emotion, and even in this apparent relief, he seemed very robotic to Sophie. "Did you not think to look for me at home?" Clara asked. Dale must have had some kind of perception filter on it. We scanned it with all the satellites, but there was nothing there. King now couldn't get his words out quickly enough. He was obviously incredibly relieved just to have her back. "We need to give you the once-over to make sure you're okay. You should be fine physically, but how long has it been for you?" 6 months, came Clara's reply. 6 months, King repeated. "You've only been gone 6 weeks. I say only." Sophie could keep quiet no longer, as King gestured for them to all walk down the corridor. "You were in there for 6 months!" she exclaimed. The corridor was so long that Sophie and Yasmin couldn't see where it ended, but they walked just the same, transfixed at the return of the friend who had vanished some 6 weeks ago. Yes, the time dilator was set up to speed time, so 6 weeks for you was actually 6 months for me. Nathan must have added in one of Miss Sissons' plugins, the Nightmare Programme, so for the past 6 months I've been living my own worst nightmare. Clara was being extremely open and blasé about what had happened. For someone trapped in their own worst nightmare for 6 months, she didn't seem massively affected. "What did you see?" King asked, but Sophie had a suspicion that she already knew the answer. Clara explained that for 6 months she had been kept lying down in a tiny glass room. People in white coats would come and look at her and study her, but she never saw any of their faces. They all wore masks, the kind that surgeons wear. Occasionally, she was allowed out, but that was so she was stood up and examined some more. She was unable to move her hands and feet of her own free will, so escape was never an option. At this point, Sophie realised that the second time she had seen Clara must have been at one of these moments. Clara also explained that a man kept coming to see her without a mask on, a man with spiky brown hair and kind but sad eyes. When he had visited, Clara felt a lot safer, but still had a strong desire to get out. Clara couldn't explain why this was her worst nightmare, but she said she'd never felt fear like it. Being out was clearly a huge relief to her, and she was in no rush to talk about her nightmare further. The corridor still showed no sign of finishing, but King and Clara stopped. By now, they were all surrounded by almost pure white, on the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, because the corridor was so long, even in front of them, and behind them was nothing but sheer white. There was, though, a random line of black on the walls. King leant forward and ran his finger down it. The wall disappeared in front of them and revealed what appeared to be an examination room. King turned to Sophie and Yasmin. "You two wait here. I'm just going to examine Clara. We won't be 5 minutes." Clara nodded as if to reassure the other two. She clearly knew what she was doing and followed King into the room. "How can you examine her?" Sophie asked. "She's in her avatar." King smiled at the apparent ignorance of Sophie, whereas Clara furrowed her brow, seemingly confused as to why her cousin didn't know the answer to that question. We can analyse her physical state through her avatar, King replied, and the pair disappeared as the wall reappeared again and Sophie and Yasmin were alone together in the long white corridor. They simply sat on the floor and waited for the return of Clara and King. They had barely sat down when they heard footsteps running up the corridor towards them. They wouldn't have been able to make out who it had been had it not been for the fact that they only knew one other person ever came here, Miss Sissons. Eventually, as the footsteps got louder, her silhouette became clear and her short, dark hair became visible. She stopped at Yasmin and Sophie's feet and caught her breath. It was a good few seconds before she could get any words out, so Yasmin jumped in first. "Are Clara's dads okay?" "Yes," replied Miss Sissons, still out of breath. "They think there was a malfunction with their implant and that they were only there for 6 minutes. Can't wait to see what they say when they realise they were gone 6 weeks. Miss Sissons seemed remarkably excited by this, so Sophie gave her a look. "What will they do? What will they think that Clara's been up to while they've been gone for 6 weeks? It's okay. I told them she's been living with you and your parents. The truth will never come out." She wasn't sounding reassuring. At some point, Amelia would talk to her brother about where they'd been for 6 weeks. Clara would then come up in discussion and Miss Sissons' terrible idea will fall down. "OK, I'll reprogram their implant and implant a false memory." "You can do that?" Yasmin asked aghast. "Yas, there isn't a lot I can't do with the freedom I have with these implants." "Yes, Clara said something about the nightmare program that you invented," Sophie said. "Why would she mention that?" Miss Sissons asked, and her face dropped. "Apparently she's been in it for 6 months, Yasmin replied. Miss Sissons' face dropped. "She's what? Oh dear. She paused for a moment, almost like the truth would be too much to handle at the moment. "But this is the only solution for your uncle, Soph," she said, changing the subject. "They will just think they've been away on holiday for 6 weeks. Anywhere they've ever talked about going?" Sophie was reluctant to accept Miss Sissons' idea, but saw no other option. "They always talked about going to New York," she told her. "New York it is, then." Miss Sissons flicked behind her ear again and changed into an old, rather large man with no hair. He had a moustache and greasy skin that looked really disgusting. His clothes also changed into a blue shirt and trouser combination that accentuated his stomach, and he had a name badge that read Mike. Yasmin and Sophie stood there looking him up and down. They still hadn't got used to Miss Sissons changing right before their eyes. She noticed that they looked uneasy. "This," she said, pointing at her new face. "He came to fix my electric meter once. Nice guy. Loved a donut or 9. At that, Miss Sissons disappeared again. Sophie and Yasmin smiled at Miss Sissons' silly randomness, knowing she meant no harm, and turned to where Clara and King had disappeared a few moments before. Sophie slumped down on the floor again. She was mentally tired, even if her avatar wasn't physically. Once again, the events of the week were catching up on her. She tried to put her head on Yasmin's shoulder and close her eyes, but her head went straight through her. She could have slept just there and then in her school uniform, with her bag on her back. That was until Miss Sissons reappeared again as herself and the hole in the wall opened up at the same time. Initially, Miss Sissons hadn't noticed the hole in the wall and started rambling again. Done. They spent a week stuck going up and down the Empire State Building because the lift had broken. Had the time of their Miss Sissons noticed King with Clara stood next to him. Clara had a look on her face that showed both disgust and immense joy all in one. Clara and Miss Sissons stared at each other, neither one wanting to be the first to speak. Instead, Sophie did so. Clara shook her head but didn't say anything. She raised a finger to Sophie to prompt her to stop. Stepping forward tentatively, Clara began to walk towards Miss Sissons. She spoke slowly, as if very annoyed as she did so. "Do you know where I've been for 6 months?" she asked. Miss Sissons shook her head. "I've been in your nightmare programme." At this, Miss Sissons' blank, sorrowful expression changed to one of concern and worry. "I screamed and screamed for you to come and get me, but every message I sent bounced back. You send me in with only you as a contact, not even Mr. King, and I can't contact you. What use is that?" Miss Sissons looked at the floor. "You know I can't look at them. This was life or death," Clara replied straight away. "You could have gotten me out after 1 day. You were my only hope. Months I spent trying to get to you. But you wouldn't look, not even when your only agent was in danger." Clara's anger was rising now. Yasmin and Sophie never had seen her quite like this before. "I can't open them, Clara. You know why." Miss Sissons sounded extremely apologetic but unwavering in her viewpoint. Clara had got Miss Sissons on the ropes now. She was really suffering and was close to tears. She knew it was her fault. Even though she and King knew it was the correct decision to make, she couldn't bear the idea of people hating her for preserving the peace. Even when her closest ally was in clear danger, she simply couldn't face that much hatred. There would have been video messages, audio abuse and threats in a million other ways, and Miss Sissons was too scared by her actions to face the criticism yet. If she had a way to find them, fine, but there was no way that she knew of. "That's enough, Clara," King interrupted. Clara could see she was pushing Miss Sissons and so stood down. Miss Sissons looked at her very sorrowfully. She looked to have aged about 10 years in the last 2 minutes. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, "but you know I can't look at those messages. I sent those agents off into an unknown world with nothing. They despise me, and it's because of my own stupidity. But I was right. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But I would get the calculation right. This agency needs keeping secret, not people showing off in front of cameras, having worldly treasures given to them for simply doing their job. Shadow is the most important organisation in the world, and I was right to do what I did." Miss Sissons's outburst seemed to change Clara's perspective slightly. She had spent 6 months away and was still in shock. She seemed to soften to what she had said and looked remorseful for her explosion before. The two of them had shared some adventures recently and had formed a strong bond that had all started at school in Year 5. Clara wasn't about to let that go. Miss Sissons was her teacher, but was also now her friend and comrade when they were at Shadow, and they needed each other's support, not them falling out. "How did you get a message to Sophie then if you couldn't message Mr. King?" Yasmin asked, slightly confused. "Being in there for 6 months and knowing what was going on, I was able to hack into the main implant server at Stratus. It seemed to be pretty easy for me to connect to that place and leave some clues for people. I tried to contact Sophie twice." Sophie nodded at this, "and I managed to leave some code for Mr. King over there to use to track what I was doing. Between them, they managed to find me. All I needed was for you and Sophie to get your implant, which was easy, as we talked about it here before. I hear, though, that I did cause a bit of a problem with my second message to Sophie." "Yeah, the whole world fainted as you overloaded everyone's implant," Yasmin added, helpfully. "Ah, sorry," was all Clara could say to that. Sophie and Yasmin were now looking slightly bemused. They thought it had been Miss Sissons, King and Mr. Houghton who had agreed they should get an implant. Now they were finding out that Clara had a say in it too. Clara noticed that Mr. King and Miss Sissons also had guilty looks on their faces. "Sophie and Yasmin have got access to the right equipment, haven't they?" she asked, thinking she already knew the answer. "Sort of," Miss Sissons replied. "They are still in soft light, though." "You two put my cousin and one of my best friends—" "What do you mean, one of?" Yasmin interrupted. "You two put my cousin and my best friend through all this, and you didn't give them a hard-light avatar?" Clara couldn't contain her shock. King and Miss Sissons had gone back to looking like they were being told off at school. "Sophie, Yasmin, follow me. It's time you learn exactly what goes on here at Shadow." Clara then started walking down the corridor again. She looked like a girl on a mission. Sophie and Yasmin followed like excited sheep. The whole truth was finally about to come out. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.